He lived in a house that was less of a home and more of a statement. It was a sprawling mansion of cold stone and glass perched on a hill, looking down on the city lights below like a king surveying his kingdom. But for the man who owned it, the kingdom felt empty. He'd made his fortune in tech, a whirlwind of ones and zeros that had translated into a life of tangible, expensive things. He had cars that purred like big cats and art on the walls that cost more than some people's houses. His latest prize, the one he was most proud of, sat in the center of the grand, echoing main room. It was a piano. Not just any piano, but a gleaming black Bissendorfer, so long and polished it looked like a slab of night captured and brought indoors. To him, it was perfect. It was a sculpture, a trophy. The fact that it was designed to make music was almost a secondary detail. His days had a predictable, hollow rhythm. He would wake up late in his vast, silent bedroom, the only sound the distant hum of the air conditioning keeping the $1,000,000 art at the perfect temperature. He'd make his own coffee, not because he enjoyed the process, but because he didn't like the staff seeing him so vulnerable in the morning. He would then walk through the rooms of his house, a silent tour of his own success. He'd straighten a frame here, wipe a smudge from a chrome sculpture there. He was the curator of his own lonely museum. The staff were part of the furniture. There was a cleaning lady who came 3 times a week, a gardener who kept the bush trimmed into sharp, unnatural shapes, and then there was the caretaker, the old man. He couldn't remember his name, not that he ever tried. He just thought of him as the caretaker. He was always there, a quiet, moving shadow in the periphery of his vision. He had been there for years, long before the new owner had torn down walls and installed smart glass windows. The caretaker was a leftover from a different time, a part of the house's original soul that the new owner had tried to paint over but couldn't quite erase. The caretaker moved with a slow, deliberate grace. His hands, though wrinkled and spotted with age, were steady. He knew the house in a way the owner never would. He knew which floorboard creaked on a rainy day and how the morning light would hit the stained glass window at the top of the stairs, casting colorful jewels across the hallway. He treated the house not like a museum, but like a living thing. He polished the old wooden banister until it glowed with a warmth that the new, modern furniture lacked. He watered the plants with a gentle touch, coaxing life from the soil. One Tuesday afternoon, the owner was feeling particularly restless. He'd just closed a deal, a few million more added to a number that was already so large it had lost its meaning. He walked into the main room, his expensive shoes clicking loudly on the marble floor. The sun was streaming through the giant windows, making the polished surface of the Bissendorfer piano almost painfully bright. And there was the caretaker leaning over it. The old man had a soft, clean cloth in his hand. He was moving it slowly, lovingly over the lid of the piano. He wasn't just wiping it. He was caressing it. His touch was so light, so reverent, it was as if he were afraid of disturbing the instrument's slumber. He moved along the curve of the leg, his fingers tracing the elegant line of wood. He was completely absorbed in his task, his focus so intense that he didn't hear the owner approach. The owner stopped a few feet away, a glass of amber-colored scotch in his hand. He watched the old man for a moment, a flicker of something like annoyance crossing his face. It wasn't just that the caretaker was touching his expensive toy. It was the way he was touching it, with a familiarity, a respect that felt somehow insulting. This was his piano, a symbol of his wealth, and this old man, this employee, was treating it as if it were his own. "Careful there," the owner said, his voice sharp and loud in the quiet room. He meant for it to sound like a joke, but it came out with an edge he didn't bother to hide. The caretaker flinched slightly, startled. He straightened up slowly, turning to face the owner. He didn't say anything, just waited. His eyes were calm and clear, holding no hint of the fear or deference the owner was used to seeing in the eyes of employees. The owner took a sip of his scotch, the liquid burning a warm path down his throat. He swaggered a little closer, a smirk playing on his lips. He enjoyed these little moments, these small reminders of who was in charge. "You know," he said, gesturing with his glass towards the piano, "that single piece of furniture right there is worth more than your entire life savings. Probably more than your family has seen in 3 generations. He expected the old man to look ashamed or angry or at the very least uncomfortable. He wanted to see that flicker of recognition that he, the owner, was on a completely different level. But the caretaker's expression didn't change. He simply looked from the owner's face to the piano and back again. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod as if to say, "I know." It was infuriating. The lack of reaction felt like a challenge. The owner pressed on, his voice dripping with condescending humor. "I bet you think you know how to play this thing, huh? All the time you spend polishing it, you probably think some of the magic will rub off on you." The caretaker finally spoke. His voice was quiet, a little rough from disuse, but steady. "It's a beautiful instrument, sir. It deserves to be cared for." "Deserves to be cared for," the owner repeated, letting the words hang in the air with a mocking tone. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed in the vast room. "Listen to you. It's wood and wire, old man. It's an asset, just like everything else in this house." He took another step forward, now standing directly beside the caretaker. He looked down at the man's worn-out trousers and simple, clean shirt. He looked at his own expensive watch and custom-tailored suit. The difference was absolute. It was a gap he had spent his entire life trying to widen, and right now it felt very, very wide. The caretaker didn't rise to the bait. He didn't get angry. He didn't even seem particularly offended. He just looked at the piano one last time, his gaze lingering on the black and white keys that were hidden under the closed lid. Then he turned his attention back to his soft cloth, folded it neatly, and placed it in his pocket. His work here was done for now. He gave the owner another small, respectful nod, not of submission, but of dismissal, and then he turned and walked away. His soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble floor, the owner was left standing alone, his scotch glass sweating in his hand. He stared at the piano, the beautiful, silent, expensive object. The caretaker's quiet dignity had unsettled him more than any angry outburst could have. It was like a stone dropped into the still, shallow pool of his afternoon, and the ripples were annoying. He shook his head, trying to brush off the feeling. It was nothing. Just an old man who didn't know his place? He took a final, angry gulp of his drink and turned away from the piano, deciding he needed to find something else to do, something else to buy, to fill the quiet emptiness that always seemed to be just a few steps behind him. The weekend arrived, and with it the people. The owner didn't call them friends. He called them contacts, associates, partners. They filled his house with a noise that wasn't laughter, but a loud, hollow echo of success. The air grew thick with the smell of expensive perfume, catered food that looked too pretty to eat, and the faint, sharp scent of ambition. Women in dresses that cost more than a monthly salary clinked glasses with men in suits so sharp they could cut glass. Their conversations were a carefully choreographed dance of name-dropping and humble bragging, a constant, subtle competition to see who was winning at life. The owner moved through them like a shark through a school of fish. He was in his element. This was his stage, and these were his supporting cast. He smiled, he clapped backs, he told stories about his latest business venture, his voice booming with a confidence he didn't always feel when he was alone. He needed this. He needed the admiring glances, the deferential nods, the laughter that followed his every joke, whether it was funny or not. It was fuel. It filled the quiet, empty spaces inside him. At least for a little while. Evening wore on, the performance began to tire him. The conversations started to repeat themselves. The faces blurred into a single mask of greed and flattery. He found himself standing near the grand fireplace, holding a glass of whiskey he wasn't really drinking, his eyes scanning the room for something new, something to break the monotony. That's when he saw him. The caretaker was moving quietly along the edge of the room, a tray of small fancy snacks in his hands. He was a ghost in this world of glitter and noise. His simple, dark uniform was a stark contrast to the vibrant silks and wools of the guests. He moved with an economy of motion, his face a calm, neutral mask. He was there to serve, to be invisible, a part of the machinery that made the owner's life run smoothly. And in that moment, to the owner, he looked like the most interesting thing in the room. An idea, sharp and cruel, began to form in the owner's mind. It was a spark of mischief fueled by whiskey and boredom. He saw a way to liven up the party, to remind everyone of who he was and the power he held. He saw a way to feel big by making someone else feel small. "Excuse me, everyone," he called out, his voice cutting through the drone of conversations. The talking died down. All eyes turned to him. He enjoyed this moment, the sudden shift of attention, the way he could control the room with just his voice. He put on his most charming, disarming smile, the one he used before closing a difficult deal. "We have a true institution with us tonight," he began, gesturing with his glass toward the caretaker. A few guests turned to look, their expressions curious. The caretaker stopped, sensing that he was suddenly the focus of attention. He stood perfectly still, holding the tray. "This is Arthur," the owner said, deliberately using his name for the first time in months, as if bestowing a great honor. "Arthur has been taking care of this house for a very long time. Isn't that right, Arthur?" The caretaker gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His eyes were fixed on a point just over the owner's shoulder, refusing to make direct contact. "He knows every floorboard, every dusty corner," the owner continued, his voice laced with a condescending warmth. "And his favorite thing, his absolute pride and joy, is polishing my piano." He let out a short, theatrical laugh. A few of the guests joined in, their laughter nervous and uncertain. They could sense where this was going, and it made them uncomfortable, but no one was going to be the first to stop it. The owner walked toward the caretaker, his smirk growing wider. "I was just thinking, Arthur. You spend all that time touching it, rubbing it, making it shine. You must think you know how to play it, huh?" The room was completely silent now, save for the low hum of the air conditioning. The guests stood frozen, their drinks in hand, trapped in the awkwardness of the moment. They were spectators at a public humiliation, and they couldn't look away. The caretaker's face remained a blank slate. He didn't flinch. He didn't blush. He just stood there, a pillar of quiet dignity in the face of the owner's taunting. This lack of reaction only egged the owner on. He wanted to see a crack in that calm exterior. "I'll tell you what," the owner said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for everyone to hear. He pulled a crisp $100 bill from his wallet and held it up. It was a gesture of pure contempt. $100? Right here, right now. If you can sit down and play something for us, anything, as long as it's not chopsticks," he laughed again. And this time, a few more people joined in, the sound a little easier, a little more relieved. The owner had set the stakes. It was just a game, a bit of fun. They could relax now. He waved the bill in front of the caretaker's face. "What do you say, old-timer? $100 for your big moment in the spotlight? Your chance to show us all what you're really made of." The challenge hung in the air, thick and ugly. It was an insult wrapped in the guise of an opportunity. It was designed to be a no-win situation. If the caretaker refused, he would be called a coward. If he accepted and failed, he would be a fool. The owner had already won, and he knew it. The caretaker slowly, deliberately, placed the tray of snacks on a nearby table. The movement was so controlled, so graceful, that it seemed to defy the tension in the room. He straightened up and looked at the owner for the first time. His gaze was not angry, but it was not submissive either. It was level, clear, and in that moment, the owner felt a tiny, unfamiliar flicker of doubt. "Very well, Mr. Ashworth," the caretaker said. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent room with surprising strength. The owner's smirk faltered for a second. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected a mumbled refusal, a downcast look, anything but this calm, dignified acceptance. He quickly recovered, his triumphant grin returning. "Well, all right then," he boomed, clapping his hands together. "Let's give Arthur a hand. The maestro is about to play." A few people began a hesitant, polite applause. The caretaker ignored it. He turned and began to walk toward the piano. Every eye in the room followed him. The owner watched, his arms crossed over his chest, already savoring his victory. He imagined the clumsy, fumbling performance. The embarrassed silence, and then his own booming laughter as he handed over the $100 bill like a king tossing a coin to a peasant. But as the caretaker walked, something began to change. The quiet, shuffling man who moved through the house like a ghost was gone. His back straightened. His steps became sure and purposeful. He didn't walk toward the piano like a man being led to his execution. He walked toward it like an artist approaching his canvas. He moved with a quiet authority that seemed to push the air out of the room, silencing the last few claps and drawing everyone into a state of tense anticipation. The owner's smile began to feel a little less certain. The game, he suddenly realized, might not be over just yet. The walk from the edge of the room to the center of it felt longer than a journey across the sea. Every guest was a statue, their eyes locked on the quiet old man making his way toward the gleaming black piano. The owner stood with his arms crossed, a smug smile still plastered on his face, but it was a smile that was starting to feel a little tight around the edges. He had expected the caretaker to crumble under the weight of all those stares, to mumble an excuse and retreat. But the caretaker didn't retreat. He advanced. When he reached the piano, he didn't immediately sit. He paused, his hand hovering just above the polished wood. He looked at the instrument not as a challenge or a trophy, but as an old friend. There was a familiarity in his gaze that was deeply unsettling to the owner. This wasn't a man about to make a fool of himself. This was a man coming home. Then the transformation began. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic shift, but a slow, unfolding change. The caretaker's shoulders, which were usually slightly stooped from years of manual labor, pulled back. His spine straightened. The quiet, shuffling gait that defined his daily movements disappeared, replaced by a grounded, confident stillness. He was no longer a shadow in the house. He was its anchor. He ran a hand gently over the keyboard lid, a gesture so full of reverence it was almost like a prayer. He lifted the heavy lid and propped it open, revealing the black and white keys waiting patiently beneath. The soft thud of the lid support was the only sound in the room. He sat down on the bench, but he didn't just plop himself down. He positioned himself with the meticulous care of a surgeon preparing for an operation. He adjusted the bench slightly, his body finding the perfect distance, the perfect angle. He placed his fingers on the keys, not with the hesitant touch of an amateur, but with the settled, knowing touch of a master. His fingers, which the owner had only ever seen holding a duster or a wrench, now looked different. They looked strong, capable, and elegant. For a long moment he just sat there, his eyes closed. The owner felt a surge of triumph. Maybe he was having second thoughts. Maybe he was frozen with stage fright. The owner was already rehearsing the condescending words he would use to dismiss him. But then the caretaker's hands began to move. They didn't press down on the keys. They seemed to float just above them, feeling the vibrations, the potential energy trapped within the strings and wood. It was as if he was listening to the song with his hands before he let it out into the world. The silence in the room was no longer awkward or tense. It had become sacred. It was a shared, held breath. A woman in a red dress slowly lowered her glass onto a table, her eyes wide. A man who had been whispering to his companion fell silent, his mouth slightly agape. The air itself seemed to thicken, to crackle with an unspoken electricity. And then he began to play. The first notes were not loud or showy. They were soft, clear, and full of a melancholy beauty that seemed to reach into every corner of the vast, empty room. It was the opening of a piece of music that most of them had probably heard before, but they had never heard it like this. Each note was a perfect, shimmering pearl of sound, hanging in the air for a moment before melting into the next. The melody was simple at first, a gentle, questioning voice, but it held a depth of feeling that was instantly captivating. The owner's smirk vanished. It didn't just fade. It was wiped clean off his face as if by an invisible hand. He felt a strange, uncomfortable sensation in his chest, a tightening that he couldn't identify. This was all wrong. This wasn't the clumsy, off-key performance he had orchestrated for his own amusement. This was real. The music began to grow in complexity. The caretaker's right hand danced across the higher keys, weaving a delicate, intricate tapestry of sound. while his left hand provided a foundation of rich, resonant chords that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. The music was no longer just a melody. It was a story. It spoke of quiet, moonlit nights, of secret longings, of a love so deep it ached. It was a conversation between joy and sorrow, a dance between light and shadow. The guests were completely mesmerized. The party, with its hollow chatter and false laughter, had never felt more distant. They were no longer a group of wealthy associates trying to impress each other. They were a congregation, and the caretaker was their preacher, delivering a sermon of pure, unadulterated emotion. Some people had closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others stared at the caretaker's hands, unable to comprehend how such weathered, worn fingers could produce something so exquisite. The owner stood frozen, his own forgotten glass of whiskey feeling heavy and alien in his hand. He looked at the caretaker, really looked at him. He saw the lines on his face, not as signs of age, but as a map of a life lived. He saw the way his body swayed slightly with the music, completely lost in the world he was creating. This wasn't an act. This wasn't a performance. This was a piece of the man's soul, laid bare on the keys of a piano that the owner had bought as a decoration. A wave of something cold and sharp washed over the owner. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Shame. He saw, with a horrifying and sudden clarity, the ugliness of his own challenge. He had tried to put a price on this man's dignity, to trade his soul for $100 bill. He had wanted to make a fool of him, but the only fool in the room was him. He was the one who was empty, the one who collected beautiful things without ever understanding their beauty. He was the one who owned a magnificent instrument but couldn't make it sing. This old man, this caretaker, this employee he barely saw, owned nothing, yet he possessed a wealth that the owner could never buy. The music swelled, filling every inch of the vast, cold mansion, and for the first time since he had moved in, the house felt like it had a heart, and the sound it was making was breaking his. The music was no longer just sound. It was a living thing. It filled the vast, cold room, seeping into the corners, wrapping around the marble columns, and finding its way into the hearts of everyone listening. It was a story told without words, a story of a life lived fully. The owner felt it like a physical pressure, a weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. He had spent his entire life building walls around himself, walls of money and success and indifference, and this music was finding every crack, every weakness, and pouring itself inside. He watched the caretaker's hands, a blur of controlled motion. They were not just playing notes. They were sculpting them. They would caress a gentle melody one moment, then strike a chord with a force that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. The owner looked down at his own hands, the hands that had signed million-dollar deals, that held expensive glasses, that typed commands into computers that moved markets. They felt useless, soft, and foreign to him. They had never created anything beautiful. They had only acquired. The melody shifted. It became more complex, more urgent. It spoke of a struggle, of climbing a steep and rocky hill. There were moments of discord, notes that clashed and created a tension that was almost painful to hear, but they were always resolved, always brought back into a harmony that felt more beautiful for the struggle. The owner thought of his own life. He had never struggled, not really. He had been clever, ruthless, and lucky. He had taken shortcuts. He had stepped on people to get where he was. He had never faced a dissonant chord he couldn't pay to make go away. The music was showing him a different way to live, a way of facing hardship and turning it into something meaningful. And the realization was a bitter pill to swallow. His eyes scanned the room, looking for an ally, someone who shared his discomfort. But he found none. The guests were utterly transfixed. A woman he knew, a ruthless CEO famous for her icy demeanor, had a single tear tracing a path through her perfectly applied makeup. A man who bragged about his lack of sentimentality was staring at the piano with his mouth slightly open, his face a mask of pure, unguarded emotion. They weren't just hearing music. They were experiencing a truth. And in that truth, the owner felt profoundly alone. He was the only one in the room who was on the outside looking in. He was the jester who had accidentally summoned a king. The regret was no longer a dawning realization. It was a tidal wave. It crashed over him with the force of the music's swelling crescendo. He saw the challenge he had issued not as a bit of harmless fun, but for what it truly was, an act of profound cruelty. He had tried to put a price on a man's soul, to cheapen something sacred for a few cheap laughs and a moment of feeling powerful. He had wanted to break the caretaker, to show the world that his wealth made him superior. But the caretaker hadn't broken. He had opened himself up, and in doing so he had revealed the owner's own brokenness. The music reached its peak. It was a torrent of sound, a flood of joy and sorrow, of love and loss, all swirling together in a magnificent, heartbreaking storm. The owner felt his own carefully constructed facade crumble completely. All the arrogance, all the confidence, all the self-importance was washed away, leaving behind the small, scared man he had always been underneath. He saw the piano not as a trophy in his collection, but as a sacred vessel that this humble man had just filled with more beauty and passion than he could ever hope to possess. He felt smaller and poorer in that moment than he had ever felt in his life. The $100 bill he had waved so mockingly now felt like an insult of unimaginable proportions. A pathetic attempt to value the priceless dot, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The music softened. The torrent of notes subsided into a gentle, flowing river of sound. The final melody was one of acceptance, of peace. It was a quiet acknowledgment of all the pain and beauty that had come before. The caretaker's hands slowed, their movements becoming more deliberate, more tender. He played the last few notes, each one a perfect, shimmering drop of sound. The final note hung in the air, a fragile, perfect sound that seemed to absorb all the tension in the room. It didn't just end. It faded, becoming softer and softer until it was just a memory, a vibration that could be felt in the heart rather than heard by the ear. And then there was silence. It was a silence so complete, so profound that it was louder than the music had been. No one moved. No one spoke. No one dared to break the spell. The guests stared at the old man at the piano, their faces a mixture of awe, reverence, and disbelief. The party was over. The performance was done, but the moment remained sacred and untouchable. The caretaker's hands rested on the keys for a final, lingering moment. Then he lifted them and placed them gently in his lap. He didn't turn to the audience. He didn't bow or seek applause. He simply sat there, his head slightly bowed, as if in quiet prayer or thanks. He had given them a piece of his soul, and now the transaction was complete. The owner stood frozen in the center of his grand room, his glass of whiskey still in his hand. He felt like a statue, a cold, lifeless object in a room that had just been filled with more life than it had ever known. He looked at the caretaker, this quiet, dignified man he had tried to humiliate, and he felt a shame so deep and so absolute that it felt like a physical sickness. He was the master of the house, the owner of everything in it, but in that moment he owned nothing. He was just a man who had been shown the true meaning of wealth and had been found bankrupt. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, threatening to break but never quite daring. It was a shared breath held by a dozen people, a moment so pure and heavy that it seemed to have its own gravity. The owner remained frozen, a statue carved from shame, his glass of whiskey feeling like a lead weight in his hand. He was the host, the master of this universe, but he was a prisoner in his own silence, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but drown in the echoes of the music that still reverberated in his soul. Then a sound broke the spell. It wasn't a cough or a nervous laugh. It was the sound of a single person clapping. It came from an older man near the fireplace, a guest the owner barely knew. His clap was slow, deliberate, and full of a reverence that was almost religious. It was not the polite applause you give after a performance at a party. It was the tribute you pay to a miracle. For a moment, he was the only one. Then another person joined in, a woman in a simple black dress. Then another. The sound grew, not into a loud, raucous ovation, but into a deep, rolling wave of appreciation. It was the sound of people who had been touched, who had been reminded of something they had forgotten. They weren't clapping for the caretaker. They were clapping for the feeling he had given them, for the glimpse into a world of beauty and depth they rarely saw. The applause filled the room, a warm, human sound that pushed back against the cold marble and expensive art, but the man at the piano didn't turn. He didn't bow. He didn't even acknowledge the sound. He simply sat there, his head still bowed, as if he were listening to a music only he could hear. He let the applause wash over him for a few moments more, then he began to move. With the same slow, deliberate grace he had shown when he approached the instrument, he reached down and gently lowered the keyboard lid. The soft thud as it closed was final, like the cover being placed on a precious book. The music was over. He rose from the bench and turned to walk away. As he did, his eyes met the owner's for the first time since he had begun to play. There was no anger in his gaze, no triumph, no smugness. There was only a quiet, profound sadness, as if he felt sorry for the man who had tried to buy a piece of his soul. The owner felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him, hot and stinging. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He was pinned in place by the caretaker's calm, knowing stare. The old man began to walk toward the kitchen, his path taking him directly past the owner. The applause was still going strong, but it felt distant to the owner, as if it were happening in another world. His world had shrunk to this small space between him and the caretaker. His heart was pounding in his chest. He had to say something. He had to do something. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. What could he possibly say? "I'm sorry I'm a shallow, arrogant fool. Thank you for showing me how empty my life is." The words were all useless, all meaningless. He remembered the $100 bill. It was still in his hand, crumpled into a sweaty fist. The idea of offering it now was so absurd, so grotesquely insulting that it made him feel physically ill. It was no longer a symbol of his power. It was a monument to his ignorance. As the caretaker passed him, the owner's hand went limp. The bill slipped from his fingers and floated silently to the marble floor. A tiny white flag of surrender. The caretaker paused beside him. He didn't look down at the money. He just stood there for a second, his presence a quiet judgment. Then he spoke. His voice was just as it had been before, quiet and rough, but now it seemed to carry the weight of the music he had just played. "The music was its own reward, sir," he said softly, and then he was gone. He disappeared through the doorway to the kitchen, leaving the owner standing alone in the center of the room, the discarded $100 bill at his feet. The applause began to die down. The spell was broken. The guests started to move, to talk, but their voices were different now. The loud, hollow chatter was gone, replaced by quiet, hushed whispers. They weren't talking about business deals or stock prices. They were talking about the music. They were trying to describe the feeling, the story they had heard. They looked at the empty piano bench, then at each other, their faces filled with a shared, unforgettable experience. One by one, they began to leave. The party was over. They came up to the owner to say goodbye, but their goodbyes were distracted, their minds still on the caretaker's performance. They shook his hand, but their eyes kept glancing toward the piano. He was the host, but he was an afterthought. He stood by the door, a forced smile on his face, feeling like a ghost at his own funeral. He had wanted to be the center of attention, and he had gotten his wish, but not in the way he had ever imagined. He was the center of a story, but he was the villain, not the hero. The last guest left, and the owner was alone in his vast, silent house. The cleaning crew would come in the morning, but for now, the mess of the party remained. Half-empty glasses, discarded plates, and the single, crumpled $100 bill on the floor. He walked over to the piano and stood before it. The lid was closed, hiding the keys that had just unleashed such a powerful storm. He looked at his reflection in the polished black surface. He saw a man he didn't recognize, a man with hollow eyes and a pale, defeated face. He never tried to humiliate the caretaker again. In fact, he barely spoke to him at all. But their relationship had changed forever. When their paths crossed in the hallway or the garden, the owner would lower his eyes, a small, unconscious gesture of respect. He saw the old man not as a piece of furniture, but as a keeper of a great and mysterious power. The piano remained in the center of the room, but the owner never touched it. He never opened the lid. It was no longer a trophy. It was a memorial. A silent, black monument to the day a humble man had used a piece of wood and wire to teach a millionaire the true meaning of wealth. And the echo of that music, that beautiful, heartbreaking music, would stay with him for the rest of his life, a constant, quiet reminder of everything he had and everything he would never have.